Hello, so my name's Dave. So I'm very interested in child language acquisition and Polish in particular. You might sound from my accent that I'm not Polish myself, but I speak it as a second language, or I try to. So this is my research. One of my supervisors is here, Anna Theakston, and one is Ben. I can't be here today, so I'm going to try and record it for him. There's a brief outline of what I'll take you through. Start with Polish noun inflection, which is the sort of area of Polish that I'm particularly interested in. And a lot of you really speak different languages, I've noticed today, so some of you might be familiar with some of the sort of concepts. So there are three genders in Polish, masculine, feminine and neuter. You can break those down into different subclasses according to the way that they inflect. I'm not interested in verbs here, I'm talking about nouns. Just to give you a bit of an example, so most nouns in Polish inflect, in fact all of them actually inflect according to case and number. So there's an example of what we call a paradigm, so a set of all the different forms of this word here, which is śrubka, which is a screw. That's a very typical feminine noun in Polish. You can see down here the different cases, 7 cases in Polish. And you've got 2 numbers, singular and plural. And then there you've got a masculine noun, again, relatively standard, czubek, which is tip. And again, you can see the different case number combinations and how the ending is the thing that changes according to the grammar of the sentence that's being spoken. And if you're somebody trying to learn this, usually you can work out the declension class or the gender of the noun by hearing a particular form in a particular context. So if somebody said, "Mam śrubkę," I have a screw, then you can kind of infer that's a feminine noun. This is where the problem starts though, because Polish, alongside many other languages, have syncretisms. So that means a particular form could be in a different case, it could be in more than one case, it could be in more than one number, and in this case, it could be more than one gender as well. So you could make the wrong inferences, if you like. So here you see how they both end in ka, cat and ka. One of them's masculine, one of them's feminine. And here these all end in the same suffix, the ki suffix. Again, some of them are singular, some of them are plural, some of them are feminine, some of them are masculine. And here we've got ek, and again, same problem. So if you don't pay attention to the grammatical context, and let's say here, this word śrubek, you'd be forgiven for thinking that it may be a masculine noun and it's actually a feminine noun. Okay, so that's the kind of bit of Polish I'm interested in here. But my overarching question is, how do kids learn that? How can you make your way through all these kind of false analogies that are potential in Polish language? So we know that kids must analogize. They can't possibly learn every single cell of that paradigm for all the words that they know. There has to be some kind of analogy. So the overarching linguistic theory that we're starting with is that the children develop some implicit knowledge through their experience with the language. They're not pre-born with any kind of linguistic rules as such. So they learn forms sort of by rote at the beginning. Then they start to make analogies. If they have to produce a certain form of a word, they've not actually heard that particular form before. But then we've got these false analogies problem, which I've presented you with. So what we do is we analyse the frequencies and the properties of Polish, sort of logical properties of Polish, and the patterns of usage in spoken Polish to try and find words which are more prone to this kind of error or less prone to that sort of error. And then we test it with kids and see if those errors actually happen when we think they're going to happen. So I'm doing a 3-part study. I've just finished my basically first year. I'm doing part-time, so second year PhD. And here I'm going to focus specifically on children's ability to hear a noun in the plural, nominative case, which is the sort of dictionary basic uninflected case, if you like, and then produce it in the singular. So see how children can singularize words. It's a little bit like a reverse Wug test, if you're familiar with the famous Wug test. It's hard to translate into English, but it's very roughly equivalent to this. So the researcher says to a child, these are taxis. And let's imagine the child might not be very familiar, very young child, with taxis. and then you ask them, what is this? And it's just one of them. And then the answer, as you know, would be taxi, one taxi. But then, sort of looking at the phonology of the word taxis, you could possibly think it may be a tax. One tax, two taxes. You know, it sounds the same. So that, it's a little bit clunky, but it's roughly what I'm doing in Polish here. The thing is with Polish, this kind of problem is far more predominant. All nouns in the plural in Polish are gender ambiguous. You can't know if it's masculine or feminine, which is why it's a really good sort of bit of language to target here. So this is what we did. So I sat on a laptop in a preschool with Polish kids, and I showed them pictures like this, which was a plural of something. Here we've got obviously screws and whoops, wrong button. And then I said to the child, to są śrubki, which means these are screws in the plural. And then I do that, and I ask the child, co to jest, what is that? And then they say śrubka, they should say śrubka, which is the feminine form, but because of what I showed you earlier with the way the Polish works, they might think it's a śrubek, which would be kind of a wrong masculine version of that word, if you like. So that's what I did. Just to kind of throw a spanner in the works even further, the wrong answer, so śrubek in this case, does exist. Okay, it's the genitive plural of the feminine word śrubka. So they will or possibly have heard that word before. So that makes it even more tricky. That word doesn't sound completely ridiculous. It sounds plausible. So if a child maybe has heard śrubek at some point but hasn't really analysed the grammar in which they heard it, they might think it's called one śrubek. So my research question is basically, to what extent does the input frequency of the target form, so in this case śrubka, and the frequency of the false target form, so śrubek in this case, affect the accuracy by which the children produce that singular form? Because they've got these two kind of competing forms in their mind. So I tested 50 monolingual Polish children in Poland in 3 preschools, aged 3 to 6. We developed a bank of 50 nouns. These were all real nouns. My second study is going to be with made-up nouns. And they all have this property of being gender ambiguous in the plural, like śrubka, which I've shown you. And then had sort of 3 main predictors, or had 3 main predictors. The first one is pretty standard, really, that those nouns were the target form, the form that you're looking for, is more frequent in Polish in general. The child is more likely to get it right. Then we've got the false target form, so the śrubek form, which is sort of wrong but exists. If that noun is highly frequent in the inputs, then the child is more likely to get that wrong. And then we have a secondary predictor, which kind of takes both of those and kind of pitches them against each other. So looking at this kind of bias. So if you take a noun and the false target form is actually disproportionately more frequent than the target form that you're looking for, then the child is more likely to get it wrong because of that. Okay. So these are my findings. The first predictor, pretty strong finding there. Quite pleased with that. So essentially, the more frequent that particular form is in Polish, child-directed Polish, the more likely the child was to get it right. So, for example, here we've got frytka, which is a chip, French fry, often spoken about in the plural because people talk about chips more than they talk about a chip. So we found that children got that a bit wrong more often than things over here like whole and ice cream and towel, which are often spoken about in the singular. So that was fine. That was relatively unsurprising, really. The second predictor, we didn't find a significant effect. So this is where we were hoping to see this sort of false target effect. So to give you an example, here, I don't think you can see that too well, but buziak, which is like a kiss, like a kind of a kiddie word for giving a kiss to your child, is very frequent in the false target form buziaka. That's the genitive form. So we kind of thought, okay, maybe the children might think it's called one buziaka and not one buziak. But that didn't happen. They seem to know pretty well that it's called one buziak, even though you hear buziaka quite a lot. So that was a little bit, at first disappointing, but then the next finding kind of explained it much better. And this was the one where we pitched the two factors against each other. And here we did have a clear finding that the nouns that are disproportionately, compared to all nouns in general, exist in this false target form were more likely to be wrong. So let me explain that with a couple of examples. Here we've got minuta, which is a minute, like as in time. And that form is very, very, very often used in the genitive plural, which means minute, basically, without the a, minut. Because you talk about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 50 minutes. When you do that in Polish, you have to put it in the genitive plural. So kids hear minut far more than they hear minuta, even though it's actually called a minuta. So we found kids got that wrong. Quite a lot of kids thought it was called 1 minute. And we had the same with raspberries. Where's that gone now? Manina. I'll see it on there. It was somewhere down here, and there was also the word manina, raspberries. Again, quite often spoken about in the plural, and for sort of grammatical reasons, more often in this false target form. So that was generally pretty good findings. Quite pleased with that. So again, just a brief summary. So 3 to 6 year olds, accurate production of the singular form is affected by how often they encounter that particular form of the word in general child-directed Polish. The opposite, so the frequency of a noun's false target form on its own does not significantly affect accuracy. But for me, most interestingly was this balance, this kind of trade-off. The accuracy of producing the correct singular form is significantly affected for nouns that have an overall bias towards this false target form and away from the actual target form that we want. And so the broader conclusion that this sort of fits into in terms of a broader theory is that frequencies and properties of the system in Polish, child-directed Polish, do have an effect on the way children learn inflection in the Polish language at least. And that's all from me. Thank you for listening. This is where I find out it didn't record anything.